The Holy Gospel this evening comes from St. Luke in the 12th chapter. Jesus says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Friend, who set me to be judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them all, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Well, then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and therefore I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God.'" The gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. Well, years ago, Chris and I finally each had a job at the same time. It was wonderful in this day and age to be able to do that. We had a kid, little one at that time. She was just turning 2, not even 2, and our youngest one was in the womb. And was at church one day, and this text actually came up. And my colleague was preaching on it at the time, but after worship service, one of our members of the congregation, who happened to be a lawyer, he said, he says, "You and Chris are just getting started, and all this kind of stuff," and he says, well, you should come over to my office. You guys got a will? And I said, no, Mike, we don't have a will. He says, "You should have a will. Come on over to my office. We'll have lunch, work out a will." So I said, "Sure, I guess so." So we made an appointment, and Chris and I were driving to his office, and we thought it was the strangest thing in the world that we were going to be writing up a will, because as far as we knew, you didn't really want to just give someone student loans as their, inheritance. And we didn't own much else other than student loans. We had a 78 Buick station wagon that was short of a Camrod, but other than that, we didn't have too much, and couldn't figure out how that was going to be if we're going to lead a will. So we went to Mike's office and we talked for a bit, and finally, he was talking about all the benefits of doing this, getting a will, and all how this is going to help. And Rachel, like I said, she's about 1.5 years old. Maddie's in the womb, and finally, Chris just stops him mid-sentence after about 10 minutes of rambling on and says, "Mike," she says, "yeah, I really appreciate this. It's really nice of you, but we don't have anything to pass on to anyone except maybe a predilection to be good-looking and the common cold, And Mike said, "Well, that is not true." He says, "Imagine you're sitting there at the intersection in the city of Chicago, where we lived at the time, and you're sitting there just calmly, the two of you, in your car." I said, "The car doesn't work." He said, "Doesn't matter. You're sitting there in the car, and all of a sudden, the guy who's delivering the McDonald's delivery falls asleep at the wheel, drives over the car, and kills you and Chris." We were like, "Thanks." He goes, "Yeah, but your kids now have an inheritance." All right. He talked us into it. So our first will had Rachel and baby to be named later as our first two beneficiaries. And in fact, when Maddie was actually born, we toyed with naming her baby to be named later. But eventually we realized that was just a placeholder and not the actual name we should name her, so we named her after a cookie. But we never really thought too much about it, and over the last 30-some years haven't really put much more thought into it than that day back then in Chicago. But it is, of course, the reminder that Jesus brings to us with this parable that he tells, that if you put your trust in yourself and what you are able to accomplish, you are going to find yourself sorely lacking when you get hit by the McDonald's truck on the corner. That if your entire life revolves around what you are able to accomplish and what you are able to do for yourself, you will have missed out on all of life. Because you see, what's most distressing about this parable that Jesus tells, where it hits us close to the core, is that this rich fool, judged foolish by God, consults no one with his abundance. Because remember, Jesus is trying to answer a question. Remember the way the story is set up in the Gospel of Luke. A guy comes up to Jesus and said, "Hey, have my brother give me some money from the family inheritance." Now, in the world that Jesus was living in, that you didn't have to do that. I mean, all the inheritance, you didn't even have to have a contract for it. If you were the oldest son, you inherited. That was it. There was no other choice. And everybody else, all the other siblings, whatever it might be, if the oldest son decided to give money, that was fine, but they were under no obligation to do so. So this person who comes to Jesus, presumably one of the younger kids, middle child, youngest child, whose father, his parents have died, and now the estate has been handed over, and the older brother has decided to keep all of it for himself, as it was his right to do. And of course, Jesus immediately says, I'm not here to judge on these kinds of things, but I will tell you a story. And he tells the story of the guy who's known as the rich fool. And what happens to the rich fool is he has a good year. And he has a good year, and so he decides to himself that what he's going to do is he's going to store up all this grain and all this goods that he has had this good year from. He's going to build himself some bigger barns so that he can eat, drink, and be merry, as he says. He only quotes half of the Greek aphorism. That goes back even, that saying is so old, it's 500 years old by the time they say it in Jesus' day and age. But the phrase, of course, is eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow you will die. Right? Written by Euripides about 500 years before Jesus is born. So this guy says, hey, I'm going to build some bigger barns, eat, drink, and be merry. That's what it's about. But he forgets the last part, which is tomorrow you're going to die. And so when he does, he's got nothing. And what Jesus says is you have to beware of making all your decisions about yourself and about the ways in which you are going to be in this world. Because the way Jesus tells the story, the guy, when he has this good year, he doesn't go to his brothers, for example, or as any of his other family members and said, hey, we've had a good year, I've had a good year, how can I help the family? He doesn't do that. He doesn't go to his own kids and say, hey, I've had a good year, how can I help you? Doesn't do that. He doesn't even go to the other farmers in the community, and they would never have done this, but he doesn't even, if he could have thought of it, to the other farmers in the community and say, hi, how can I help you? And he doesn't go to the priests and the rabbis or whatever and say, hey, I've had a good year, how can I help our community? How can I help our town? No, he wants to just help himself. And what Jesus says is that's where the foolishness resides. The foolishness resides in thinking that life is all about helping yourself. None of us were created to help ourselves. All of us are created to help each other. None of us are created to help ourselves. All of us are created to help each other. Now, we have responsibility. And this guy, for all intents and purposes, was obviously a good farmer. I mean, pretty clearly, he could help out. He had some skills. But he didn't want to share them. He didn't want to use them for anybody but himself. And nobody is given gifts and skills and talents to hoard them and to not share them. or to use them only for yourself. What Jesus wants us to see is that when we are living in this world, we are living in this world on the grace and trust of God. And it made no sense to Chris and I 35 years ago to sign our names to a document in which half of everything that we owned would go to someone named Baby to be named later. It doesn't even make sense now, and I'm telling you the story. But it's never about me, or even me and Chris. It's never about Rachel, Baby to be named later, whom we now call Maddie. It's about how we live together as a family. And that baby to be named later grew up to be a raucous, hilarious, funny young woman. I mean, last week she did a stand-up routine, and when your job is a stand-up comic, you're not really rich, okay? In fact, there isn't even a definition for poor that you can use, because we haven't come up with that level of poor yet. But that's what she is. So her mom's got a birthday. She's got a birthday. So Maddie, stand-up comic, has a whole bunch of people. She says, you know what I'm going to do for my mom's birthday? Can't buy her a gift. I'm going to have my mom stand up, and everybody in the audience is going to sing happy birthday to her. But, and those of you who know my wife, you know that she's a very brilliant woman and very dedicated. She is a doctor. And so Maddie says, when you say happy birthday, say, happy birthday, Reverend Dr. Chris Alexander, which is my wife's title. And lo and behold, 100 people down in Florence stand up and sing happy birthday to my wife. Happy birthday, Reverend Dr. Chris Alexander. Happy birthday to you. And Chris is like, oh, it's the greatest birthday gift ever. I mean, that's what it's about. That's about family. Maddie says, yeah, you may wonder how stand-up comic can have a mother who's a reverend doctor. Well, let me tell you about my dad. We wouldn't trade any of those moments. And we were so grateful to be there for all of them. And should our day come walking out of here tonight, I'll hope to remember all the great times that young baby to be named later brought me. And all the wonderful smiles and hugs I received from Rachel, her sister. And the life I was able to lead with my wife. I hope that I can remember. I mean, the funny thing about that will, the executor for that will, we didn't know anybody else who actually knew how to add other than my dad, so we made my dad the executor. My dad's been dead for 5 years. But I wouldn't have traded anything for those last 25 years with my dad. It was never about me. It was always about what God was able to do through me, with me, under me, around me. Most of the time, God had to work around me, as you can imagine. I got a great plan. If Scott would just get out of the way, it would work. And what Jesus wants us to see, why he tells stories like this about the parable of the rich fool, is that life is a woven tapestry of relationships that start with God and continue to filter through all the days, months, and years of our lives. So that hopefully, should time allow, we can look back decades later and not remember how much we've had or how much we accumulated, but rather who we loved and who loved us. Many of you who are gathered here today, in the last 5 years, and it's my 5th anniversary this month of being involved with you, I buried some of your family members. Brothers, sisters, husbands, wives. And I will say this. Every single one who I had the privilege to be able to bury, I heard great stories about. People who cared about the people that God had sent them with, people who cared about their jobs, cared about the land, cared about something other than themselves. So that when we had the funeral and celebration here in this room, there were good stories to be told, wonderful stories to be told of a life well lived from friends and family because that person had cared about them. It is a sobering reminder, of course, to come here and to realize that we're not all going to live forever. But it is also an important reminder to stay focused on the gifts that God has given us to cherish. And they are not things that you can put into barns or silos. The things that are important live and breathe next to you, around you. They exist as a wisp of a memory. These are the things that God has entrusted to us. These are the gifts we cherish and share. Amen.